There has been a lot of post-election analysis on the shifts that we saw from demographic groups that have been traditional supporters of the Democratic Party, such as young adults, women, Hispanics, but little media attention has been given to the Christian vote, which my next guest says made the difference in the race for the White House. Joining me now to unpack what he and his colleagues found is Dr. Adam Rasmussen. He's a fellow at the Cultural Research Center at Arizona Christian University. Dr. Rasmussen, welcome to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. It's my pleasure to be with you.
So let's, before we jump into that, I want to address something else that, there was a lot of enthusiasm. I mean, we saw kind of what would be described in modern terms, based upon what we've seen in recent years, a landslide shift toward Donald Trump. But the overall voter turnout was actually down from 2020 if the current numbers hold. Speak to that.
Happy to do so. Yes, in 2020, it was 62%, but what we at the Cultural Research Center predicted is that it would be down, and it looks like it'll be about 55% of the total voting population came out to vote. And sadly, that trend was the same with those who identify to be Christian. So it was 55%, only 1 point up for Christians. 56% of those who say they are Christians came out to vote. And that's just not very good at all, Tony.
Well, okay, so let's start there. Let's break down, because you've got several different subcategories of the Christian vote. There were a couple that were actually up, some were down. Let's talk first about the ones that were up.
Well, one of the most exciting that I think to watch, I'll just go right for that, is the SAGE-CONs. And this stands for Spiritually Active, Governance-Engaged Conservatives. And they voted very strongly in the 2020 election. 99% voted. And we saw that again in the 2024 election. And they represent 5% of our total population in the United States, but 7% of the election population this time. And that was very exciting to see.
Yeah, sure. In fact, most of our audience, most of our viewers, listeners fall into that SAGE-CON category, spiritually active, governance-engaged conservatives. So while we're on that particular subgroup, what did they point to most as helping them make their decision on how they would vote in this election?
Well, they looked at things that were different than the other side. Abortion was very popular. Of course, SAGE-CONs are not going to vote in that direction. And we saw that our church is encouraged by talking about things like religious freedom, addressing poverty, crime, law, and order. And this translated again to the SAGE-CONs coming in, and they voted on these issues.
And in terms of determining their, as I read down through some of this information, their faith, obviously very important in guiding that decision. Party platforms played into their decisions, as well as some of the other subcategories.
Absolutely. The SAGE-CONs have a different way of looking at the way that they're going to vote, because they have an above average political attentiveness and participation, and they have that conservative political ideology and commitment to Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And party platform, not necessarily the personality or the character of a candidate, is much more important to them. And again, that's why they come out and vote in droves, 99% of them.
Yeah, they're, of course, by definition, spiritually active, governance engaged. They're going to be there. So our big task, I think, and this is what we're focused on at Family Research Council in Washington Watch, is growing that element of the population, because they also have, as we have studied, a greater influence on family and friends because they're plugged in, they know what's going on. Let's talk a little bit about the young adult vote, Hispanic. Those were new votes for Donald Trump. What about the younger evangelical, younger Christian? What do we know about them?
Well, they aren't as involved with voting as we saw with our older voters, and um, they're more moved towards voting again on being being pushed more towards not liking a political candidate, perhaps a candidate not reflecting their views, and we saw that with the younger generation as well. And unfortunately, some of our research shows that the younger they are, the more apt they are to be positive on allowing abortion under any circumstances. So while your boomer, theologically defined born again Christian, would say that they are not for abortion, the Gen Z, for example, the youngest among us, they were focused on the not theologically defined. Many of them, a majority of them, said that they were for abortion. And this is something that we really have to turn around.
You know, I think, Dr. Rasmussen, but if you look at historically, and I know we don't have time to unpack that today, but younger people tend to be a little more liberal on some of these things until they get older and they start having children, they start buying houses, they become more economically conservative. But the big challenge we face is that young people are putting off marriage and childbearing, which prevents them from moving over into that more conservative ideological category. We're up against a break. We'll pick that up on the other side of the break. Also, want to look further into some of these segments and also get you to unpack the reason some people didn't vote. As you just pointed out, the numbers have dropped from 2020, which is surprising, I think, to a lot of people. But why? What did people point to as the reasons? Dr. Rasmussen, thanks for staying with us. So I want to talk a little bit. We've got about 5 minutes. I want to talk just a little bit about some of the motivating issues. You touched on that in the last segment. Then we'll talk about why people didn't vote. Inflation topped one of the issues. I mean, the economy, people are feeling this thing. I mean, Christians feel the same thing as everybody else. They got to put food on the table. You know, when we saw Kamala Harris talking about abortion every time she spoke, it was very interesting that more women voted for Joe Biden in 2020 than they did for her in 2024. And what that tells me is more women were worried about putting food on the table than aborting their children. And so these pocketbook issues do matter. While abortion is a major issue for evangelicals, so is feeding their children.
That's true. And what we saw is that 72% of those who came out to vote were Christians. And they have values. And as you were mentioning, the values about raising families and living through this economy matter. And we saw that probably because of the platform of the Republicans and Donald Trump, Christians gave a 17 million vote advantage or cushion to Donald Trump. And because the margin between the two of them was less than that, it was insurmountable. And that is something that we really should explore.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues I found very interesting, theologically identified evangelicals placed relatively higher emphasis on immigration. 40% chose it as a deciding factor in their candidate selection. Is that because of an underlying concern about law and order and understanding the breakdown of the rule of law?
Oh, I think so for certain. And living here in Arizona, a border state, that's a very important topic to us, and it should be to the entire country. And as we know, that's one of the major responsibilities of the federal government, is to have safe borders. How could it not? And that was a decisive factor for certain.
So as you point out about the Christian vote, I think 72% of those who voted identified as Christian. Is that becoming a big defining issue, whether you are religious, Christian, or non-religious?
Well, I think this particular season, the Christian faith, as you know, Tony, is to be salt and light in our country. And right now, because we hold 72% of those who voted, that's a good thing. And Christians outnumbered those of other faiths or non-faiths 5-2. But, and here's the part of statistics that's interesting, we really didn't come out to vote as much as we should have. Only 56% of self-identified Christians voted. But that's greater in percentages than the other groups. 53% of non-Christian faiths and 48% of those who have no faith.
Okay, so let's talk. Let's break that down. We just got a couple minutes left. Why? Why did they not vote?
The others,
let's talk about the Christians. The Christians who didn't vote, those who identify as Christian. Why didn't they vote?
Yes. Well, sadly, 20% of them said, I was planning on it, but I just didn't get around to it. So there were several reasons, but I mean, that was one of the highest. And what a lame excuse that is. I was going to do it, but I didn't get to it. I forgot, or something like that. And other reasons were I thought it might be rigged. I didn't think my vote would count. Perhaps I didn't like one of the candidates. It wasn't pleasant to me to vote. Politics is not that important to me. These are some of the reasons people were giving. But as you and I know, Jesus Christ, it needs to be Lord of all of life, not just on Sunday mornings, but Mondays too, and not just the parts of life that are easy for me.
Right.
All of life.
Well, even more so for the difficult issues. That's where we need to lean into our faith more, because it provides guidance and direction for us. In your research, did you? And we just got about a minute and a half left. Do churches need to give more guidance and direction? I'm not talking about endorsing candidates, but Christian citizenship. The churches need to speak more into that.
Yes, I mean, the numbers weren't great. We wanted just to bottom line it for you, Tony. We found that perhaps if there was a last minute push, pastors and family members and churches could encourage those 32 million Christians we were calling to come out and vote, okay? And that maybe that might push another 5 million to the voting polls. And we need to be more engaged in those things.
Yeah, I mean, that 20% that said, well, I just forgot, didn't have time. I mean, if the 2 Sundays prior to the election, their pastors had been saying, don't forget to vote. We've got voter resource. We've got a platform comparison. We've got voter guides for you. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but it should be pretty evident to you when you look at their policies and you look at what the Scripture says. That could help, I think, significantly. Dr. Rasmussen, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate the work and appreciate you joining us today to tell us about it.
Thank you so much, Tony.